Hi, I'm Caroline Hardaker, the author of upcoming dystopian novel Composite Creatures, coming out in April 2021.
And I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm the author of the Slavic mythology-inspired novel, The Second Bell. It's just come out and is available everywhere in all the formats. And this is Bookish Take.
Yay! So this is our series where we talk about writing processes and getting published, from submitting all the way through to the very end of the process. Eventually we'll be talking about too. But today we're going to talk a little bit about world building and our approaches to world building. So just in case you're not familiar with that term, world building is, for want of a better description, it's basically the dreaming up and planning and delivery implementation of all the different elements of the fictional world that your story is based in. So you can take it to so many extremes. So you've got to think about the environment, the politics of the society that people are living in, how people relate to each other, what languages they speak, what the wildlife is like, the history of the area, even the climate and the weather. If you're writing a fantasy or a science fiction novel, you could take those to anywhere, but it's about keeping the rules sort of straight and coherent through the whole thing. That can be quite tricky. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I wanted to start with asking Gabriela, who is predominantly a fantasy author, why do you love to create fantasy worlds above other genres? What do you find in that process? What do you enjoy about it?
Well, it's a kind of, freedom to really explore all kinds of, real issues or questions you have about how society works, but in a way that doesn't necessarily feel didactic to the reader, and that allows you to explore things that are a bit more sensitive and sort of more difficult in a way that doesn't feel as threatening. So that could be sort of one reason, but also just, the freedom of imagining a world that can be as different from ours as you like, or as similar, and has its own rules, and coming up with those rules. I like the way my mind works. I really like creating this kind of, it's like a net. So you create, if you create, a political system or something, then all of the other elements of the everyday life have to slot into place with this. If the rules governing a society are significantly different to what we would expect in our world, then there has to be a good reason for it. And all the logical sort of links to that have to be followed through. And that's just something that I find very exciting to do. And I was wondering, when it comes to fantasy worlds, there's this sort of subcategory of dystopian worlds, which is something that your novel Composite Creatures sort of deals with. And I was wondering, what sort of draws you to that kind of darker side of world building? And do you see the world in Composite Creatures as our world, or is it parallel to ours?
Oh, I discussed that in my own head quite a lot when I was writing it. And ultimately, I think it is our world. I see it as very much a modern, almost like a modern day England, but with one small twist. And that's either a twist which could mean it's a very near future, or, it could be almost, I suppose it could be like an alternative England where there's been a particular scientific development which is shaping society. And I guess what draws me to writing things, because my next novel, which I'm writing at the moment, is similar in that it's very much like our world, but there's just very subtle changes. And I think I must be much more intrigued by writing that, because I do feel like I'm really interested in the uncanny. the uncanny being things that are eerily familiar. So it has to be as real as and every day as we can make it. But then you just twist things just a tiny bit to make it a bit more creepy. And sometimes you don't even need to think about making it more creepy. It's just that little twist where somebody almost thinks, oh, that's a bit wrong. That feels a bit different. That creates this sort of sense of eeriness and like low level horror, I guess. But it's like that dream, it gives a kind of dreamlike quality. So in the case of Composite Creatures, pretty much everything is as we have it here, but it's a slightly more polluted world. So I just thought about mainly the environment at the very beginning of the writing process anyway, to think about how that might have affected bodies of water, so lakes and things. So like now we still have lakes, but what will be living in them? Will people still go fishing? That kind of thing, and trying to implement that in the story. But that's what I'm doing at the moment. But I've not ruled out doing something a lot more wacky in the future. I've always had it in the back of my head that one day, that will probably be quite far away, I'm going to write a full fantasy epic with like a full magical system, a completely different planet, like I'm thinking like Middle Earth or Thra or something like that, and I think that will have many more obstacles to overcome, but I guess ultimately the skills will be the same. So you'll still have to record things in a certain way, make sure that everything's coherent, make sure that things make sense, because once you've made one world building decision, you have to make sure that that fits all the way through the story, but then also make sure that, say with the bodies of water, say when they're polluted, people don't go fishing in them anymore. Then you've got to start thinking about, what do people serve in restaurants? Will they still be eating fish? Will there still be fish around?
Will there still be restaurants?
Yeah, exactly. Will there still be restaurants? Like what? So yeah, they have long-standing consequences, a lot of these things. But when we're thinking about just general world building, I was going to ask you, Gabriela, how do you start thinking about world building? Like, when do you start thinking about it?
I think, I mean, obviously it so depends on what kind of a book you're writing, and how different it is from our world and what elements you want to focus on. So The Second Bell is a very intimate sort of novel. So it's quite small in scope. We have two small communities that we're focusing on. So we don't really know necessarily how they fit into the wider world of that country that it's in. But I basically start with a kind of, so the main premise of The Second Bell is that sometimes children are born in this community with two hearts, and those children are strigas. And how does this community react to those children, and what do the children's mothers do? And it kind of leads from there. So you kind of imagine, if a child was born with that kind of, set of characteristics, how would people in that sort of society react to it? What would be sort of when you look at sort of human history, what would be the most common sort of reaction to that? And obviously love and understanding is not necessarily where humanity goes to as their first sort of choice. So if it happened once, there would be a different reaction. If it happened more often, there would be some rules set up. Some rules would be already in place. If it had happened for generations, so you kind of start, it's like what you said with, like, if the lakes are polluted, nobody's fishing, then what happens if you want to go to a restaurant? Is it all plant-based? But if the rivers are polluted, then where are the plants grown? It's kind of, and if you let your mind unravel in that way, in terms of, just think about all the possibilities. I really like, there's a Terry Pratchett quote, I think, sometimes, where he was talking about sort of that specific thing, and he was saying that, when you're writing fantasy novel, I'm completely paraphrasing, when you're writing fantasy novel, you can you can have a world where pigs can fly. But if pigs can fly, then you better make sure that the inhabitants of that world carry very sturdy umbrellas.
Yeah, this is
So
very
it's
true.
obviously, it depends on whether you want to go the humorous side or the dark side, or like in terms of whether you're going light or whether you're going twisted or both, or it's but I think because the world has to be created in a believable way, you have to make sure that even if you go humorous, that it has to be logical. It can't be you can't have a disconnect in terms of the logical links. If you say if A plus B equals C, then you can't have B plus B equals D randomly, so separately.
Yep.
The main elements. So it has to be a logical sort of conclusion of of the initial premise.
What about the side of because your novel, though it's a fantasy, it's like a history as well. So where do you start? I've never written anything based in any other time other than now or in the future, where you can just invent anything you want. But things based in a historical context, I guess, need to be quite well researched and planned out. How did you get around that for the second bell?
Well, again, some elements you can make up, but when you're trying to present something quite so, for example, if a character lives in a forest, there can be, you can make up edible berries, that grow in that forest, but you can't necessarily make up that, like, okay, if there's those edible berries, are they enough to sustain that person? Is it, you have to again think in terms of a wider scale of things. So there is a lot of research. I wanted the setting of the second bell to be quite sort of pre-industrial, but there's almost like a time warp, because there's the human community, this mining town that seems kind of pre-industrial, but we're not entirely sure what kind of it could be, sort of equivalent of our 17th or 18th century sort of mining village that is quite sort of cut off, really. They trade, but we don't see much of that aspect of it. And then we have the society of outcasts, the strigas, that are sort of thrown out of town, and they and it's almost like you go back to a Stone Age sort of society, because you're thinking, okay, if all those people were really cut off from the world, if mothers were only allowed to leave with what they had on their backs, if they chose to be banished with their striga children, how would they have gone about creating a community that was self-sustaining, essentially, in that kind of an environment? So you have to research how, because obviously there are communities that are completely self-sustaining in almost every imaginable sort of environment on this planet. So you don't entirely make it up. If there's what kind of animals can they keep? Can they keep animals? Can they what can they grow in a kind of on the latitude that they are at? How much would they be depending on foraging in the environment where winters are long and cold?
So do you do this as you go along when you're writing, or do you do a lot of this before you've even started?
I think it depends. If the main premise of the book is something I don't know a lot about, then I would do research first. But when it comes to something like the second bell, you know, the elements that I need to research, I come across as I write. So, you know, I think, okay, what kind, as I'm writing, for example, I'm describing home that the main character's mother kind of had built for herself.
Right.
And I'm thinking like, so what would that kind of house look like, you know, in that kind of latitude, in that environment? What materials did they have in hand? And I would do like quick research. I'm quite good at researching, but I'm kind of like a bit of a magpie, you know. I just like look for the shiny bits,
Collecting it all.
yes. Just to give a taste of a kind of real environment, you know, it made sense, for example, to, if they're keeping animals in that kind of climate, they would not keep the animals outside. They would keep the animals inside, because in a sort of Stone Age settlements, people relied on the warmth of the animals as well as, you know, whatever else they produced to kind of to help keep the house warm. You know, how would they what sort of a fireplace would they build? It's just detail like that interests me, and I think it kind of really adds a flavor to
it's like you've got to be a sort of social historian to carry it all through. It's great.
I mean, you know, I don't, a little bit. I think it depends on also what kind of a book you like to write. So I like what you like to read, I mean, sorry. So some people like less detail when it comes to the when you're painting a picture of what sort of world the characters are living in. So some people only like novels where there's, you know, they want things to happen. They don't care about the whole surroundings of it. You know, they just want like a quick sketch of what the sort of, I don't know, magic system is like, or what the political system is like, but they just want to see the character run through the streets, you know, in a big shootout. They're not interested in how they cooked their dinner, sort of thing. Whereas it matters in the second bell. It's not, the everyday details matter. So it's just a different kind of book. So obviously, because I'm interested in the details and how they contribute to the to the character's journey, and they do contribute, then, you know, I have to spend a little bit more time on that, and I don't want to make stupid mistakes. So if you don't do the research, then you can insert elements that kind of pull the more knowledgeable reader straight out. So you have to be quite careful in that way. So, you know, if you put something in, make sure that it fits.
Makes sense.
And like, what is, so, you know, I said that like the detail of a kind of every day is important to me in world building. And what details are important to your world building when you're creating your kind of, because you create quite intimate scale novels as well, but obviously it's a world that is quite similar to ours. So what do you focus on?
Yeah, you're right.
It got really dark side, by the way. I just need to comment on that because
I know it's going to be pitch black soon. Just going to be sitting in the darkness. It's atmosphere. It's atmosphere.
Dystopia.
I know. Yeah, this is how I write. I write in the complete dark. Yeah, no, I think you're right. They do tend to be quite intimate, and I tend to write in first person. So I'm really interested in not just the world, but it's how we perceive the world. So using Composite Creatures, every element of world building is something that directly impacts the protagonist Nora's life. So this would be the weather when she's looking out the window, her workplace, the air quality in her workplace. So things, more grand scale things like the political system and the economic system of the UK at the time. aren't really there. They do filter in, because even when it's a really intimate piece, they need to be thought out, because it needs to make sense. The world needs to make sense, and it's good to infuse these things even a tiny bit, just to show that they actually exist. So in the case of Composite Creatures, I think the only political parts of world building that come into the story are the occasional advert on TV, or something, a news report that comes through. Occasionally she'll see a protest on the street. She's not actually engaging with this protest, but it is there. So it's fitting these things into the background, really. But most of the world building was about how she perceives the world. So one big theme is wildlife being disappearing from the world due to pollution and various other aspects. So it's how she would.
It's basically our world, isn't it?
It
you
is.
call it dystopia. True. You're just describing like
no, it's depressing though.
Yeah.
So, it's almost like our world, but a generation or two ahead. And it's how she might engage with nature. It's trying to imagine how someone might engage with nature in a world that doesn't really have nature as such. So she might remember stories from her parents or her grandparents about birds flocking through the sky, or mice in the back garden, that kind of thing. So I put in a lot of world building elements through memories as well. So whether they're memories of her childhood, or just memories that she thinks she remembers, but maybe doesn't necessarily remember how it exactly was. So yeah, it's very domestic, and I really focused on the stuff that she comes face to face with, or encounters, and didn't put as much emphasis on the other stuff. But if I was writing a third person piece, I feel like I would have had to be a lot more overt in thinking about elements, grander elements of society, politics. But because it's just from the perspective of an everyday person, it didn't matter as much. But it still meant that there's absolutely tons of stuff to think through and to keep records of. And for me, I'm really old school. I didn't mean to be, but I am, in terms of how I record these things. And I use big sheets of paper and lots of coloured pens, because I like it really visual. I'm a really visual person. So I like mind maps, I like charts. And I like having them all next to each other. I did try using tools on the computer and saving things, but I like to see things alongside each other. So I even put them up on the wall, like I'm mental, just to create, just to
with
create
a red thread, kind of just linking.
Yeah, exactly. Just scrolled over the top. But I was wondering what sort of tools you use, considering how many elements of world building you have to think about in terms of the fantasy stuff and the history stuff. I imagine you are a lot more tech savvy than I am.
I don't know. I mean, I use Scrivener to write in. So it gives you the option to keep all your research notes and photos and all that in one place. So you can quickly access it. There's one of the novels I was writing. I have a whole sort of subchapter saved on like seaweed farming or something, so it can be quite specific because you'll need it for like a very small element of the world building, or but a lot of it I just research as I go along, honestly. I mean, I don't and then
add it into Scrivener.
I just, if I'm thinking like, oh, how would you build that kind of a trap? I go research it. I was like, okay, that's how you build it. And then I go in there and I write it.
Yeah.
It's like, I would like to say that there's something more mystical to it, but it's just quite straightforward in that sense. And, some of the biggest tool, the best tool you have is your own memory of, how you experienced certain things in the world, because all of that, however much you change it for the purpose of a fantasy novel, that's your biggest resource. And, I mean, for me, when you're trying to create a world that's very convincing on, in terms of how all the senses of your protagonists as well, how they're experiencing that world. So it's not just how, so for example, if I was writing, like, I know, this polluted lakes or whatever, I would think about how would they smell? Would you be able to smell them, or would you have to have like some kind of mask on, what would it feel like? It's now we know what it feels like to walk around with a mask on all the time, but it's, how, can you touch it? Or is it like toxic to touch? What would happen if something splashed you? It's that kind of a, if there's snow, can you, if the snow falls, like, does it feel wet? Does it stay together? Is it dry? It's all about that. And all of those things are memories that, you have, and you're just thinking about how to apply it to a speculative scenario that you might have not experienced, but all of your experiences can add up to something new if you sort of think about how to turn it around. And like, are there any kind of elements that specifically, I was thinking, like, that you would like to expand on in future novels? So you were saying that you would like to write like something totally different, something epic in scale, completely world. And how would you go about switching from the kind of this intimate novel to that very epic?
Well, I suppose, though I said my next novel is quite intimate as well, there are aspects of it which are not. So it's sort of an in-between. It's an in-between house, and I'm having to plan. It's not quite trolls and things, trolls and mythical creatures, but it's halfway there. And I'm finding that, again, my approach is quite old school, and that I've been drawing things. So this involves a lot of maps, actually, which have really helped. And I really wish I'd done it for Composite Creatures. It might not be relevant to everyone, but I think I like to not be constantly aware of space in what I'm writing. So one thing I did do for Composite Creatures was I had a rough floor plan of the house that the novel's setting, because much of it is in one house, and I needed to have a really clear idea of where the rooms were, where they were in relation to each other, where the stairs were, what color the rooms were. That's quite important. And so I've done that on a grander scale for the next book, in terms of the landscapes and the distance between places, because that's quite important too. And having that there when I'm writing means that I can draw or sketch out or write on extra stuff that comes up. So if I'm writing a scene in one little village and it's on there, and I've written down that there's a post office, or that there's a wood around the corner from the bus stop or something, I can write it down on there, because I know I need to revisit that later when he comes back to the visit to that village. So for me, it's a process of writing as I go along. And I think when I finish this novel, whatever the next one is, because I think the next one after that might be a little bit more surrealist as well, I'll have to expand that even more, I guess, from the beginning. But it's reassuring for me to have those notes from the very beginning, because I think if I'm reading a second draft and having to try and map out all of these things that I've forgotten, and then finding that they don't make sense next to each other, then that's an extra, for me, that would be an extra draft of work. There's no time to do that when I already redraft everything from the first draft. What about you? Is there anything else you're going to try and expand on in the next works that you're writing?
So my mind tends to go to sort of like intimate novels, sort of in terms of scale. But there is something I'm working on that is a little bit more expansive. So I'm going to sort of see how that goes before I say anything more, because it might not pan out. But, you know, you have to experiment, and you have to keep sort of trying to sort of stretch a little bit when it comes to your what you do.
You totally do. And I think if you're experimenting, that means it's good, because you're doing something completely new. So I think that's a great thing to do. But
I think that kind of covers world building. So
yeah, it totally. I mean, there's a whole world of stuff that you can literally talk about with world building. But I think that's probably all we have time for in this episode, particularly because I'm literally going to be in
You're
darkness.
actually the dark. It's
I'm
just
moving closer to the camera to get lit up more as the minutes go by. So thank
something
you.
Slightly vampiric about this setting.
I'll just disappear into the darkness at the end of the video.
I like how you committed to it as well.
It was entirely planned.
There was no attempt to turn on the light. It was just, it's entire.
There's no lamps nearby. I'd have to literally walk away to do it. It's really bad planning on my behalf. But anyway, so thank you. Thanks for watching, everybody that's been watching. And hopefully we'll be back soon with some more episodes to talk about writing and submitting and everything else involved with getting published. So thank you very much.
See you next time.
See you.